Hi everyone, and welcome to our mod 1.3a on neural communication and the endocrine system. Here's your vocab, pause if you need to. So we are getting into the minutia of the nervous system. We talked about the nervous system in mod 1.2. Now we're going to be talking about each neuron within that. Remember, we talked about how there's billions of neurons just in our our interneurons. There's billions of those, right? So our whole nervous system is made up of neurons, and what those are a nerve, that's the basic building block of the entire nervous system. And each neuron is made up of these parts. There are the dendrites. These are the branches of the neuron that receive a message from the neuron around it. Okay, they don't touch. There's something called a synapse between them, which is the space between two neurons. The dendrite receives the message. Here's the cell body, right, with the nucleus. The soma is the cell body. Okay, and then that is going to send the message through the axon. The axon is this purple in the inner part here. And that is the trunk. Sometimes these are extremely long, like neurons in our legs are really long, for example, or they can be extremely tiny, like interneurons in our spinal cord. And that sends that message along the axon to the axon terminals. The axon terminals release a chemical message. So this is an electrical signal that's sent through the neuron, and it releases chemical messages that are neurotransmitters. And they release them out of the axon terminal into the synapse, and the dendrite is right there. They are extremely close. I couldn't even show you with my fingers how close they are. Remember that game in the car with your sibling of like, I'm not touching you, I'm not touching you, like, I can't even show you. Like, they're so close to each other. Wrapped around the axon here is something called myelin sheath. This is a layer of fatty tissue. This is the yellow here wrapped around, and it is this fatty tissue that speeds up the neural message. So this is the very fast nervous system, okay? It can go from 2 to 200 miles per hour. The glial cells, these are a type of cells in our nervous system that are called like the helper cells. So think of the neurons as like the queen bees, right? They're important, they're very important, but they can't do certain things. So glial cells are the helper cells that are going to nourish, they're going to get rid of waste, they're going to guide the neurons on like what connections to make. They are the worker bees. They are in like the more complex the species, the more glial cells there are. Okay, so glial cells are helper cells. So I know this looks intimidating, but we need to talk about how a neuron communicates with another. We will be doing some demonstrations in class to kind of help with this, but you need to know that a neuron is it works with an electricity. Sorry, I can't speak. And they send chemical messages. Okay. So it needs to have a certain electrical stimulation in order to send a message. It has to be a strong enough charge to send a message. So it starts off in resting potential. In resting potential, the outside of a neuron is positive ions, and the inside of the neuron is negative ions. This is our resting potential. When there is an action, when there is a message being sent down the neuron, so it's firing, it sends that electrical charge. This action potential is when that flips, okay? And something called depolarization happens. Depolarization is when the gates open. So think of that axon and it having all these little gates along it. So it happens in order. So there's like a cycle to it. So the gates open here, and it's kind of like a sewer lid flipping off the information flowing out. So it's kind of like it bursts, right? It's going from being positive outside, and those positive ions are pushing into the gate and flooding it with positive ions. And so it's the neuron is changing from becoming negative at resting potential to becoming positively charged. Okay, when the gates open and the positive ions flood into the neuron becomes negative. Okay, so this is a chain reaction where the next gate will kick open. This should say positive. It becomes positive. Okay, so after it does this, after it has done an action, here's the action right here, right? It goes through a period of reuptake and a refractory period. So let's start with refractory period. So refractory period is where the electrical charge goes below even resting potential state, meaning it couldn't fire even if it wanted to. Now, this is so fast, it's faster than a blink of your eye, like faster. So it's very brief, but there is a slight, I don't even want to call it a moment, where the neuron cannot fire again. And that is called refractory period. Okay. And also during this process, neurotransmitters that were not taken by the next neuron, we're going to talk about what neurotransmitters are in a second, but they go back into those axon terminals. Remember, they're released through axon terminals. They're picked up by the dendrites of the next neuron. The ones that don't get picked up get reabsorbed in a process known as reuptake. Okay, so sometimes the message that gets sent is excitatory. There is a high electrical charge. It's like pushing the neuron's accelerator. And sometimes they are inhibitory. They're like pushing the brakes. They're slowing things down. But regardless, neurons fire in an all or none response, meaning they are just sitting here at resting potential. And here's our threshold. It is like the flushing of a toilet. Okay, stay with me. If you press that toilet handle just a little bit, some water might flood in, but the toilet does not flush, right? You have to hit it a certain amount. It doesn't matter if you slam the toilet. It doesn't matter if you just do it normal. However you slowly, if you pass that point, right, and it's a certain electrical charge, you don't need to know the specific number here. You just have to know that there is a threshold. And if it hits that amount of electrical charge, it will open the gates. It will go to action potential. So it is all or none. It doesn't go faster if it's excitatory or slower if it's inhibitory. It either goes or it doesn't go. It either hits that threshold or it doesn't hit that threshold. That is the all or none response. Okay? It's either the toilet flushes or it doesn't. Okay, so let's talk about the messages that those neurons actually send to each other. These are called neurotransmitters, and these are chemical messages that are sent through the neurons. We're going to do some more work with this in class, and I want you to pause here and really absorb. I want you to take down, sometimes they will ask you questions about which one is related to Alzheimer's disease, which one is related to Parkinson's, too much of this, too little of that. So over here where it talks about examples of malfunctions, you should write down, don't write down complete sentences, right? But bullet points of the meanings of these. So let's start with acetylcholine. It's abbreviated ACH. So there is the word ACE in acetylcholine. So the way I like to help you remember acetylcholine is the word ACE. So think of an ACE bandage. An ACE bandage can be wrapped around a muscle when you've injured it. Acetylcholine is the message. If we are moving our hand, if we are running in soccer, we are using acetylcholine. Remember that our nervous system is controlling everything we do. Our thoughts, our feelings, and our actions. These are everything. Okay? So they're controlling our muscle movements. Acetylcholine also controls our ability to learn. And this could be our ability to learn like a new dance move, or a new way to do something with a soccer ball. And also memory. So acetylcholine, so ACE can be also used for learning and memory. In order to ace the test, you have to learn and you have to remember. So an ACE bandage and acing the test, acetylcholine. These Too little of acetylcholine is correlated with Alzheimer's disease, and those ACH producing neurons deteriorate. So a loss of acetylcholine. It doesn't mean that it causes it. It could just be a factor, right? It's correlated. Dopamine is a very important neurotransmitter too. All of these are very important. We're only talking about like key ones for intro psych here. So dopamine, I want you to remember pleasure or reward. This is not the same as happiness, okay? Happiness, I want you to think serotonin, like mood. Dopamine, pleasure, reward. For example, people can get pleasure and reward from using heroin. This does not mean that they are happy. Okay, dopamine is part of our addiction pathway. It's part of our reward center. It is the biological button that tells us to do something again. Okay, it is released at certain times in terms of natural selection so that we survive and reproduce. Okay, so it tells us to do that. That thing felt good. It felt good. Not the same as happiness. So do that again. So excess dopamine is linked to schizophrenia. This is why certain drugs that release dopamine can trigger a genetic response that if you already had in your gene pool schizophrenia, it can trigger schizophrenia. A lack of dopamine, Parkinson's. Okay, so serotonin, I already talked about. And dopamine, you can remember the word dope to remember like it's like that drug, like addiction, pleasure, reward. Serotonin, mood, hunger, sleep, arousal. If you are familiar with selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, those are medications that people take for things like depression and anxiety. First, for depression, it was introduced. And that is because it affects our mood. Mood is not like a momentary state of being happy, excited, or sad. It is like the lingering moods that we have, right? And those SSRI medications, when you're on them, the doctor also asks you, how are you sleeping? How are you eating? Arousal, this is our state of like being awake or unconscious, by the way. And so those are all connected to serotonin. If we don't have enough, that is chemically linked to depression. Okay, so norepinephrine. And I don't have serotonin. I don't have like a little mnemonic or thing for you to remember it. Serotonin, happiness. It's the only reason why we feel happy. If you are feeling happy, you have some serotonin releasing. We all release these things naturally to a certain extent. Sometimes we just don't get enough of a certain one. Norepinephrine. This is our controlling our alertness and arousal. So think of an EpiPen, right? If someone is given an EpiPen, it's like a jolt of arousal, right? You are super aroused, meaning super awake, aware. If you've ever had an EpiPen, it kind of like makes your heart beat fast, right? So this helps control that level of alertness and arousal. GABA, G-A-B-A, this is a major inhibitory, right? So it's pushing the brakes. It's telling something to slow down. Not enough of this, right? Not enough of telling the brain to slow down. If the brain is sending too fast messages, that can be linked to seizures, for example, or insomnia. GABA is the major neurotransmitter that's involved when people drink alcohol. We'll talk about this when we talk about drugs. Alcohol, what does it do to our reactions? It slows things down. So when people, you could remember this one by like when people get drunk, they might get gabby, they might get GABA. Glutamate is the opposite of GABA. It is a major excitatory neuron. Foods that have MSG are giving you glutamate in your food, and that is excitatory. And if you are already prone to things like seizures, you don't want to be consuming a lot of MSG because that can overstimulate your brain and lead to a seizure. Something called substance P. So P is for pain. So the reason why we feel pain is because we have messengers that Their purpose is for perceiving pain. They're called substance P. These chemical messengers, right, in our nervous system are sending that quick message through that electrical charge in the neurons that, hey, that hurt, right? If you don't have substance P, and there are like some very rare instances where people are born without substance P, you cannot feel pain, which sounds great, except think about all the reasons why you need to know if your stomach is hurting or if your teeth are hurting, right? You go to the doctor, you get things checked out. So it's actually very dangerous to not experience substance P. Finally, endorphins. So again, people sometimes struggle with this because endorphins also not happiness. Happiness is serotonin. Remember that. Endorphins are our brain's painkillers. Please write down endorphins, painkillers. So when we're talking about in the future mods, we're talking about like drugs, for example, endorphins are our body's natural painkillers. So we feel a runner's high, and that's previously been linked to endorphins. That's because we're not feeling the pain, right? You might feel sore the next day. You're not feeling it now because of endorphins being released. Our body has its own like morphine, right? Which is like the synthetic version of endorphins. Okay, so some of these neurotransmitters are agonists, meaning that they stimulate a response. Some drugs are agonists. And so some of these drugs might be agonists, meaning they're exciting your dopamine or they're exciting your serotonin. And they're stimulating that response. Others are blocking a response, a molecule that binds to a receptor site and inhibits or blocks it. Okay, so let's look at this agonist. Drug is enhancing the cellular activity of whatever this natural chemical is, right? It's, you're feeling this chemical more. Let's say it's serotonin. Whereas an antagonist is blocking that thing. So the natural chemical is that cellular activity is blocked. Okay, now let's move on to the endocrine system. So we're out of the nervous system, we're into the endocrine system. This one moves slower. This one is not an electrical charge through neurons going to 2 to 200 miles per hour. It is a chemical message. So it is slower. I know it's confusing because neurotransmitters themselves are chemicals, but they're sent via the neural system. The endocrine system works with glands that secrete hormones into our blood system. So think of it as like mail versus like text. It's a little bit different in terms of speed difference, but similar. It takes a while. So hormones are chemical messengers that are created by our endocrine glands. They can regulate our metabolism, our sleep, our growth, our reproduction, homeostasis, body temperature, all those things. Two main ones, these are the two you need to know, are adrenal glands, which are the pair of glands above your kidneys. They secrete epinephrine, so think of fight or flight, norepinephrine. These are our fight or flight drugs, hormones. And pituitary gland, this is our master gland that is located in our brain. Our brain tells the endocrine system what to do. So this is our most influential because it's in the brain. It is the master gland. I think of it as, if this is helpful, which it might not be, but if you've ever watched you've heard of the concept of a pit master in like those like famous barbecue things like where the people are really exceptional at barbecuing, there's someone called a pit master. And there was actually a show called Pit Master on one of those like reality shows. And he is the master gland. He controls all other glands and tells them what to do. Okay, so again, you don't need to know all of these things, but this is a layout of the endocrine system. Here's the pituitary gland telling everyone else what to do. So if those adrenal glands, which we do need to know, are being told maybe our sympathetic, our fight or flight in our nervous system is being activated. That is going to tell the adrenal glands to start kicking in that epinephrine into the bloodstream. Now, that is why, because this takes a little bit longer, you have different hormonal effects lingering after your fight or flight is already stopped. You might be going into parasympathetic, but whatever the hormones that the adrenal glands secreted are still affecting your bloodstream. Why can't I go to the next slide? There we go. Okay, so in the brain, I just want to quickly tell you that the part of the brain that controls the pitmaster, the pituitary gland, is our hypothalamus. Our hypothalamus regulates our hormone system, our endocrine system, okay? That's what I want you to get out of this graph, okay? So the pituitary gland does not simply activate itself. Here is our hypothalamus, and it's such a weird looking gland, right? Here is our pituitary gland. The hypothalamus, which is part of the brain, tells the pituitary gland what to do. So the pituitary gland's in charge of all the other glands, but the brain is still ultimately in charge of that too. Here's just a comparison chart. You can pause that if you want to. So takeaways. Remember the difference between an agonist drug and an antagonist drug. Inhibitory neurons, excitatory neurons. Remember that neurons fire in an all or none response. They have to either meet that threshold or they don't meet that threshold. If they meet the threshold, they're going into action potential and they're being flooded with those negative ions. If right after, they go into that refractory period and they can't. Make sure you know all the parts of a neuron and be able to label them on a diagram. We're going to do more with that in class. All right, that sums up Mod 1.3a, and I will see you in class.